Okay, so I'm going to take you to a small island off the coast of Nova Scotia. It's known as Cape Breton Island. This is a place where my mother's family is from. Historically, in Cape Breton Island, they had three primary industries: coal, steel, and fisheries. Unfortunately, the coal and steel industries left a bit of a scar on the community in Cape Breton, where there is an overly concentrated volume of illness that lasted several generations as a result of contaminated land and water. The net benefit cost of the short-term economic stimulus of the jobs created by these industries did not fully consider the cost of healthcare over these future generations that it was going to take. It was not factored into the value of those jobs and those companies over a period of time. I'm going to talk to you today. I'm going to introduce you to the concept of the impact of math based on my area of expertise, which is quantifying social impact. The image before you is called the Interconnected Global Risks Map. It actually belongs to a publication that came out at January 15th of this year, 2020, and it published by the World Economic Forum in their Global Risks publication. So, oddly enough, Global Risks Interconnected Map. And what it does is it shows us the interconnectivity on the 5 most imminent threats to society as we see them today. And it's a report based on perception, which is very key. We look at the technological threats, we're looking at economic threats, we're looking at geopolitical threats, climate threats, and also societal threats. The report, in summary, tells us a few things, and I'll just highlight how devastating this is. The sky is officially falling, according to this report, and it's very real. From a technological perspective, the report tells us that although 50% of the world's population is now online, the global systems have not actually kept up with the demand of global challenges that we're facing today. We know that healthcare systems around the world are now unfit for purpose. We know that AI is the new frontier of geopolitical competitiveness. And we know that quantum computing is amassing personal information faster than any time in history. And yet cybercrime will actually end up costing us about $165 billion by the end of 2021 just to manage. Economically, the report tells us that we have a globally synchronized slowdown. This is the lowest growth period since the 2008 financial crisis. Foreign direct investment is at all-time low, debt is at an all-time high, and the emerging markets of today are said to be the leading economies by 2050. Geopolitically, multilateral systems no longer hold as states begin to adopt nationalistic postures. And we know that protesting inequalities is on the rise. Environmentally, the ecological systems are being devastated at a faster rate than any time in history. And it's said that the ecological loss, the biodiversity loss, they've already put a price on it. It's already cost us $33 trillion. So out of 7.6 billion people on the planet, we actually only account for 0.01% of all living creatures in the planet. And we've already managed to devastate 83% of mammals and over half of the world's plants. From a societal threat perspective, as is usually the case, and it was consistent with this report, when we talk about societal threats or effects, we talk about them as an afterthought. We talk about them as a consequence of the other elements. As a consequence of biodiversity loss, over 20 million people will be subject to involuntary resettlement each year. As a consequence of climate change, we're facing a food crisis because over 115 of our top crops actually require pollination by animals, and the insect count is on extreme decline. So the point that I'm making here is that climate change in this report dominated all 5 categories as the #1 threat to society facing us today. And what I'd like to do is spin this on its head a little bit and look at things from a different perception. This report is based on perception. So I want to take a deep dive into the social factors and the social dimension. What if we were to put the social issues at the forefront of climate? How would it change on the outcomes of a report like this? If we consider how the global marketplace, the global investment, capital markets, and the global investment sphere of things is responding to the global crisis in this order based on perception, you would stumble on a market known as the socially responsible investment market. This market now accounts for over 30 trillion in assets under management, 20% of global capital markets. But it's rapidly moving towards a mainstream strategy, and they're estimating that it will be something like 90 trillion in assets in the next couple of years. However, as a subject matter expert, that makes me very excited until I lift the hood and I get into the products and I get into the strategies, and I get into the data, and I get into the benchmarks, and I get into the definitions, I get into the metrics, I get into the weighting. I love this stuff. This is math. I love it. Very exciting. And what I came to learn was actually a really disturbing prognosis, basically. So what I found is that there's almost no social content. There is no information on the social elements of this market. 90 trillion in assets under management. We're not even talking about social yet. It's leaning about 90% in the direction of environmental and the climate crisis based on perception. And yet we know that the climate-related threats are man-made. And we're not addressing the social dimension. There's a subsection of social responsible investment, which is SRI for short, called E, S, and G, environmental, social, and governance. It accounted for $502 billion last year in the US just alone in assets under management. Standardization, when you get into this market and you get into the products, so the products would be like values-based driven, mission-based driven, impact-based driven, exclusionary. So I'm no longer going to invest in oil. I'm no longer going to invest in tobacco or weapons manufacturing. I'm going to remove everything that's harming the climate, and that is going to be my strategy. But we're still not talking about where they are placing investments in other parts of their portfolio. So let's talk about standardization for a second. So I'll give you an example. So some of these strategies will look at maybe gender, diversity, equality, CEO pay. Other strategies will look at things like human rights, labor rights, health and safety issues. But the standardization issue is that human rights, as it's defined by a company's policy, as it's defined by an international best practice standard, and as it's defined by a responsible investment strategy, are completely disparate. There is no standardization about what we mean when we say human rights, what we mean when we say modern slavery, what we mean when we say labor standard, indigenous standard, land tenure, and about 1,200 other metrics that we're looking at on the social sphere. It's non-existent, and the data is not there to support it. Materiality. This is a content or a source content that would demonstrate evidence of performance in these areas. Today, so everything from a tweet to a NLP robo-advised algorithm that captures sentiment and controversy on tagging keyword entities and buckets them by volume and severity, to a well-wordsmithed policy produced by a company and submitted to the bank for approval for financing, are all considered material sources of evidence. Check the box. Don't get me started, right? Value recognition. The most telling sign of our analysis, we started digging into these products, is where these products, they're like ETFs and index funds and pensions and mutual funds and all the strategies, responsible strategy behind them. When we dig into them and we look at value recognition, how do they weight things? How do they score things? How do they qualify things? We see that, again, it's 90% leaning towards environmental. There's a little bit of governance, and the governance kind of says, if something blows up in the news and you haven't disclosed it, you're in trouble. You're going to get a fine and regulation, and maybe it'll affect your stock price for a little bit. But we still haven't talked about the social dimension. And we've not given it any value. Value creation. I want to talk to you about value for a minute. There's a gentleman by the name of Nick Szabo. He's a polymath. He wrote a piece in 2002 called The Origin of Money. And within that document, he talked about the origin of value. And he tells us that the origin of value actually predates the value of money and even language. And that value is used to describe the mitigation of aggression between people. So and then if you want to get really prototypical, it goes even further into like the early stages of psychology, where psychology will tell us even our own genes, the biological genes, we're fighting for strategic competitive survival. And this was evident in the selection of a mate. This evolved into what we created, what we gave value to in terms of reciprocal favors, what we valued as equal in terms of mitigating the aggression. And that had later evolved into bartering for goods and services. And later, that became the value of money. The value of something is established by demand for it. There is no demand evident on the social content based on the SRI, that $90 trillion market. We need to look at where we place value historically. We're talking about financial performance. But we've not considered the long-term effects of some of our decisions, like the story in Cape Breton. 4 generations of 6 people, $33 trillion in biodiversity loss. What did our investments get us? Short-term gain, long-term pain. So we want to apply some new lessons. I'd like to introduce you to a quantitative model called social return on investment. It was built through the London School of Economics, and originally it was developed to advise governments on how to spend their money within the community. What it can tell us is for every dollar I spend on an anti-smoking campaign, it will return to me $3 in the reduction of cost burden that it takes to manage that disease. Smoking-related diseases cost the world $136 trillion. There's a lot of $136 trillion numbers going here. $136 trillion. And yet tobacco is a sustainable crop for centuries. And the demand is still there and it hasn't been removed. Let's talk about the role that regulation plays. We now have labels on packs of cigarette that says, this is your fate if you continue down this road. But we're not going to stop it because it's kind of a stable source of income. And we're going to take a cut from it. So it's staying so long as there's demand. This is the way the world works. This is where we place value. Second controversy. We need to consider for a second what the cost burden is by accepting impact wash-based products. A lot of this do good, do well language, for profit, for purpose, we're on it, we're going to save the world, we're going to drive the bus towards putting a Band-Aid on all the symptomatic climate issues without even talking about the social ones. It's not a full picture. We're impact washing it when we don't have the full picture. We could look at things like, and I want to like Tesla. I want to. I really do. But if we talk about the electric vehicle market in general for a minute, there was a study done that showed the net benefit calculation for carbon emission reduction basically negated itself 5 years after the car leaves the lot, based on the damage it did to produce it. Why aren't we placing value here? Value is so important. We decide what that means based on demand. The difference between an investigative journalist and myself is that I've come up with a solution. I started my company 10 years ago. I was working in the mining industry, and I was working in quantifying social impact of these communities that were affected by these projects around the world, where there was no data. These are undocumented human beings. They don't own land. They don't have a birth certificate. They own nothing. And they're grateful to have a job. What is the cost, though? This has been my job for almost 2 decades, for the better part of 2 decades. And what I learned over studying in this sector is that there's a correlation between the companies who actually really cared and did something about managing the social issues, reinvested in the communities, so that they would have something to sustain, some skills, some small businesses, some microfinance loans, some financial literacy, a new trade training. There was something beyond life of mind to sustain them. This was a large part of what I did in my role. So what we did was start to look for how much it cost a company when there's a catastrophe. So maybe there was a protest against the mine and they had to shut it down. How long were they down? Were they down a month, a year, 10 years? Were they done for good? They were down for 7 years and a new company had to come in and buy them. How much did it cost them and their shareholders? And what effect did it have on the community? Can we quantify that? That's math. Yes, we can. Can we place a value on it? Yes, we can. What we started to do is look at all the companies that had these problems. And what we learned is that the ones who cared about and placed value on the social issues and managed them well from a social management system were far financially superior, not only to their peers, to their industry, but also the market over time. So then we looked at the companies that had catastrophes, that weren't managing it well, and we looked at whether or not they had anything in place at all, and they didn't. So they were not resilient, they were not able to rebound. And so what we decided to do was, okay, using this model, can we look forward-looking? Can we start to predict companies that don't have anything in place, which ones are going to blow up next? Can we do that? And the answer was yes, we can. And the way that we did that is we started heat mapping. We started building algorithms to kind of track all this stuff in real time. So using NLP and algorithms to measure social management of companies both internally and externally as they go. And what we came up with was early detection market signals. If you are an investment in this room, you know how valuable that is. If you know that something is going to explode before it hits the news, you've just made a ton of money. I have now created value based on social management. I've now placed emphasis. I could show you how to make money by putting things first. This is where we're going, but the SRR model needs to adopt it. So we created looked at 40,000 public companies back 5 and 10 years for these signals. So we've amassed a incredible data set that we're bringing to market that we're going to try and bake into some of these SRI models and show them the difference that the social dimension can make. So I think the numbers tell us that our perception is wrong or that it's missing something. It's not the full picture. And the patterns tell us that if we continue down this road, we're going to continue to create asset and market bubbles. They're going to sneak up on us and explode because we don't have the full picture considered. We have not given it any value. I don't think that the climate crisis and the climate market is wrong, but I do believe that the S in ESG is missing. And I think that the impact of math has the power to shift where we place value based on our demand for it.